All right, everybody. So we have Lyle McDonald with us today. I'm sure 99% of you know who he is at this point. He has been around for a very long time, written tons of articles, books. He's been on a lot of podcasts. So welcome, Lyle.
Thanks for having me.
So for the 1% of people who don't know, can you just briefly explain how you got into this? Like I said, I know you were really one of the first people to really make this well known.
So short version of long story, I grew up in the 70s and 80s as kind of an inactive suburban kid playing video games and eating a typical diet. I got into sports in high school because I had mandatory athletics and started cycling, swimming, got into martial arts. Of course, like every 16-year-old, I wanted a gym membership to go lift weights. And this all led me ultimately to UCLA to study exercise physiology, for lack of a better way of putting it. During that time, I got involved in competitive rollerblading, which was this is talking 88 to 93. So we're talking probably before most people listening to this were alive. Rollerblading was still a sport, got into competitions. And like so many, I wanted to fix myself, right? Since had always been a chubby little kid, fat loss was always of interest as I got more into competitive athletics. And I had done triathlon and stuff like that in high school. I wanted to be a better athlete. Right? I read all the magazines. I wanted to believe all the ads, all the magic. I would go to my professor's office hours and annoy the crap out of them, and they'd tell me it was all garbage. And basically, I just started reading research. That's kind of where it was, just to improve myself and nutrition, training, supplements. Got out of college in '93. Got on the internet basically when it was starting. This was back when AOL gave you 4 free hours. On a CD-ROM like this. We're talking way back in the day. And, I happened to be kind of in the right place at the right time as the internet was starting, and I was on Usenet in the late 90s. Everybody knew they had to have a website, but nobody knew why. And I realized, for younger listeners, they can't even conceptualize this. They can't, because y'all have been around since the web existed. I watched this transition. Nobody knew what the internet was. My first browser couldn't even show graphics. It was Mozilla 1, and it would just show image 1 goes here, right?
Yeah.
It made surfing adult sites really difficult. Anyway, and so nobody saw these websites were we want to pay you to write articles. All right, cool. But they didn't have an income stream. Right. So then in the late 90s, everything kind of went, the whole .com bubble blew up and all of that. But regardless, so going back, when I came out of school in 95, I was a college grad. I knew everything, right? Yeah, right. But I thought I did. And I liked writing. So I would we were on Usenet. And I think I was one of the first people to really start trying to bring science to this industry. So you can either credit me or blame me for where things are now. And in the evidence-based practitioners, and there's a lot of good that's come of that, and there's some bad that's come out of that. And of course nobody was ready to listen. What do you mean you don't have to eat 6 meals per day? That's what we all nobody was ready to listen then. So I ended up writing my first book, The Ketogenic Diet, in 1998. Which should have nearly gave me a nervous breakdown. No joke. That kept me from writing for 3 or 4 more years because I couldn't finish a book because that was such a nightmare. And, I've watched the internet change. There's a lot of people that are big in the industry now that basically came up reading my stuff 20 years ago because I'm now the old man in the field. I've written, 14 books since then on various, about every 10 years, I write a super heavily researched book that makes me want to quit. Ketogenic Diet was in 98. The protein book was in 2008. And of course, last year was the women's book. It's about every decade I write a book that just wants to try to destroy myself. And in between, I've written my Rapid Fat Loss Handbook, Ultimate Diet, little injury book a few years ago when I broke my leg. I do like to point out that in 2004, I wrote that guide to flexible dieting, right? I wasn't the inventor of the concept. I believe I was one of the first to formalize it. And of course, no way. You have to eat clean to get lean. This will never work. 15 years later, every human being on the planet in this industry talks about that. Some of them even give me credit for it. But I was just a decade too early for anybody to be willing to buy into that. So yeah, this is my 25-year career. And like I said, I've been here. I've watched it develop. We were talking about before we started, from Usenet to listservs to forums, and then, MySpace, I guess, which I didn't get into, and then Facebook. And then now we're moving to Instagram and Twitter. And it'll be, I don't know where it's going to go next, but we'll see. So
yeah, and it's funny with all of that because, I definitely was that person who, when I first got into this, as I think, like I was saying, like 12 or 13, I read the ketogenic diet book. That was the first book in this field that I ever read all the way through.
I really am sorry, but yeah.
But, it really got me hooked into everything. And as we were talking a little bit before, you did kind of lay a platform for this. And something that you'll hear a lot, which is something I wanted to get into, is that people will say, well, Lyle McDonald, he's an ass, but he's right, and you do have this kind of reputation in the field where you are very controversial. And, you were talking about before how you knew everything as a college grad, right? Sarcastically. And, full disclosure, my younger self and you definitely did get into a debate at one point on one of your forums. So
probably. I've argued with everybody. So.
Yeah, me and everybody else. So,
and honestly, some of that, for a while, some of that I think was somewhat an affectation. It's the joys of the internet. And some of that was, and this is something else I'm always happy to talk about. About 4 years ago, I was actually clinically diagnosed with bipolar 2, which is the lighter form of bipolar. And you could probably go back through my posting history over the last 20 years, and you can tell when I'm depressed and you can tell when I'm hypomanic. Because when I'm depressed, I don't say anything. When I'm hypomanic, I just go off on people because that's just part of the nature of that. Since getting medicated 4 years ago, I'm better. I'll just leave it at that. I'm very critical. I don't play well with others, and I never really have. And as much of it me being an ass, I get really, I guess angry is the right word. This has been my passion since I was probably 16. When I first really got into athletics, there's that trite saying about, your passion will choose you, that kind of thing. But as soon as I found that one thing, I knew it's all I wanted to do. And it was literally it's literally all I've done for, good Lord, over 30 years. And so I get really, I think, frustrated when I see folks contributing what I see as bad information to the industry that, I'll admit it, there's times I hate this industry. I don't hate anything. There's times I dislike this industry. But it is ultimately, the thing I dedicated my life to. So I think that's part of it. I just don't like when BS is being spread. And since I'm not part of, and I've never been part of the big circles in the industry in the 90s and 2000s, it was a different set of people. And it was a lot of marketing and it was a lot of this, and they all kind of supported one another, even if it was all garbage. And I've never either had to do that or been willing to do it, right? I'd just rather, I'm very uncompromising to a fault, almost to my own, probably self-harm to some degrees. But yeah, I don't care who it is. If I think you're saying BS, I'll say so. And if you don't like it, well, too bad. And that's kind of it. So,
yeah.
And I've lost, I've had, I guess, friends in the industry, internet people, and as much as any of us are friends, and that know them. And I've lost lots of those, and it is the way of things. But at the end of the day, I'd rather be right than liked.
Right. And I think
I'm okay with the consequences of that.
I think the most recent example we saw of that was with the whole Brad Schoenfeld study, and I think most people are pretty aware of that. And then you had the debate with Mike Israetel. So obviously people can check that out themselves. I was just curious if you had any afterthoughts on that. I know you did write up a big post for the people who don't like to read.
Yeah. Nothing's really changed. They of course have refused to back down. James Krieger is still throwing different statistical analyses at this. And even that almost bugs me more, right? There is a game that people in this industry play where they are critical of gurus until it's their turn to guru, right? The kind of stuff that everybody, and it's other people have done that. Lane Norton did it with metabolic damage, right? He set himself up as the anti-guru, the guru killer, until it was his seminars on the line. And then he engaged in every single tactic he had ever been critical of, right? The hypocrisy kills me. And that's what I'm seeing here, right? If any other researcher, if any paper that group didn't like, the people had been playing these sorts of games, they would have been incensed at that. They would have never let this go the way I'm never going to let this go. It's only okay in the same way that, one of my favorite bits that came out of the debate, right? Evidence-based practitioner used to mean research. Now it's, and don't get me wrong, research does not have all the answers. There is much to be said for the 100 years of empirical evidence, bro science, whatever you want to call it. And in many cases, research has completely confirmed what the athletes figured out. But in just as many, it's found that they were wrong, like meal frequency, like skipping meals. So it's not as simple as going, well, bro science is all, sometimes that's what we do research. And Mike said, oh, well, the new evidence-based triad is this: research, anecdote, physiological basis. And I'm like, that's great, because you can never lose an argument. If the science doesn't support you, fall back on anecdote. And if anecdote doesn't support you, fall back on, well, this has a basis to it, right? All these people used to say that the plural of anecdote is not science. They won't let anyone else use anecdotes until it's their time to use anecdotes. So that's as much my, and I took Brad to task, and I took James to task, and I took others to task. And what did they do? Delete my posts and block me. That's just flat. And why? Well, you were mean to me. F you. I'm mean to everybody. Maybe y'all need to thicken your skin and man up, right? And this industry, well, do I want to get into this? Let's just say that there is often an insecurity that goes with getting into bodybuilding, right? I'm not trying to cast too broad of a net, but let's face it. We've all been 15-year-old males who thought that if we built lots of muscles and got strong, suddenly the world would not scare us anymore, right? There's actually a really good book called Gorilla Suit. It's by a bodybuilder from the 80s. And he talked about that. He was bullied as a teen. And he thought if he could build a gorilla suit of muscles to look big like a man, people would leave him alone. And I see a lot of that in this. It's just part of the psychology. But unfortunately, the insecurity doesn't go away. And everybody's happy with you. People tell me all the time, Lyle, I love it that you're so critical. I love it that you won't take any BS until it's theirs. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, Lyle doesn't know anything. Lyle, I have no respect for him. It's like, whatever. Like I said, I'd rather be right than liked. And maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe more research will come out. But the statistics on that one paper did not support the conclusion, no matter how many games they tried to play. One of the individuals who defended it, who I won't name because I actually try not to do, he's crowing about his thesis, having these super strong statistics. And they are. That's fine. So why did you defend these crap statistics? Because it keeps them in the seminar circuit. Let's just cut to brass tacks. Because it is professionally beneficial for him to keep that group happy. That's what I think is going on. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't say that, oh, my statistics are super strong, and go, but I'm still going to defend this crap. So anyway, yeah, but beyond that, I still stand by my conclusions. I still, maybe new research will demonstrate that I was incorrect. And if that happens, I'll be the first one to say I was wrong, right? People like to say Lyle's never wrong. Go look back at my history. When the research is there, I will admit that I'm wrong. And what's funny is I've never seen the gurus ever be fallible, ever. It's funny how that works. I've never seen a single one of them. Somehow they're just always right. It's really amazing how that works. Because also I try not to open my mouth until I've done the research. Once I've done the work, and figured out what I think the science supports, that's when I'll open my mouth, not before. So yeah, if more research comes out showing that 45 frickin' sets per week, which is asinine, I just because it's funny, I went back and looked at one of Brad's earlier studies. It was the one that looked at internal versus external focus, right? Again, bro science, you focus on the muscle or just lifting the weight.
Right.
And they did 12 sets per week, heavy, 8 to 12 rep max on a 2-minute rest. So quality work. And I looked at the percentage change. And those 12 sets generated about double the percentage increase in bicep thickness that his 45-set study did. Huh. Now, I know you can't necessarily compare studies that way. That's not necessary, but it is kind of indicative. So what it meant, 12 truly heavy sets gave double the percentage growth and probably double the millimeter growth if I went and looked. And let's face it, Brad's doing the measurement himself, so at least that's consistent, as doing 45 junk sets. Because that workout was impossible. Have you ever done 5 sets of 15 rep max squats on 90 seconds rest? No, because no human being has ever done that in the history of ever and survived. Women maybe, but the workout was impossible to complete with any decent way. So yeah, it was just a bunch of junk volume. The statistics didn't support the highest volume. There was all compounds, right? And I wrote a 3-part series, and I'm like, look, you can't say 15 sets of bench presses, 15 sets for triceps, or 30 sets of benches, 30 sets for triceps. You can't. We know better. And if you math it out and cut it in roughly half, which is what most people, including Mike Israetel, Eric Helms, oh yeah, kind of about half to one. Okay, fine. So your middle group that did 15 sets, effective sets for triceps, got the best growth. Well, 10 to 20, there you go. Boom. Solved. If you actually look at this study rationally, where the moderate group statistically had the best results and math out the sets rationally, fits right with the model. And yet somehow, I mean, no human has ever needed 45 sets a week to grow. Even the guys that were using drugs in the 80s and 90s never did that much. And yet somehow this one study showed that double the volume of any other study was, sorry. Like I said, maybe the follow-up, maybe by a different lab that's blinded. You know, we've got the study Israetel was involved with. Above 20 sets, we get huge water retention. We got to take that into account now too. You want some really, I don't know if you've seen it, there's the same group that did that study with Mike Israetel has done some reanalyses of the data, like additional analyses rather. In a paper that came out last week, they looked at the muscle biopsies again and showed that all of the growth was actually sarcoplasmic proteins. It was like enzymes, and it wasn't actually increases in muscle fibers, right? It was just increases in the other stuff. And, you know, they were the ones that found water retention above a certain point. And it's like, okay, well, the 2 groups in Brad's study that supposedly grew the best also were above 20 sets per week. So we've got some unanswered questions about fluid retention, about edema. There's another study on women that was interesting that not only did they blind the text, which is important, they actually waited about a week to do the remeasurements again. And the results were it's women, so it's hard to tell, but you know, this measuring 2 or 3 days after the final workout, there might still be fluid retention.
Sure.
And I mean, there might not be, but we don't know what the impact of. So there's a lot of stuff that I think needs to get answered first. So my stance still is that for the grand majority of cases, a maximum of 20 hard sets per week, 20 quality sets, right? I would rather see someone do 10 sets of whatever, 6 to 8 or 8 to 10 with 2 minutes rest with reasonable weights. I guarantee you that'll get you better growth than doing triple that with a short rest so you can't use heavy weights. So my stance has not changed, and if more research comes out to support that belief, then I'll be happy to say I was wrong. Let's see if those guys do the same.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, you know, I've talked to Eric, Mike, Greg, James, like about this study, and the advanced statistics is definitely a little out of my wheelhouse. But what I will say, you know, from your standpoint, and just kind of what we were talking about before, where, you know, how you have approached certain people, not necessarily just this study, I can definitely relate to it being very frustrating when you know something or something that you've been doing for a decade or more, and somebody else comes along. And I think we see this all the time in this field because, you know, unlike many other fields, we go by how somebody looks, right? And there's such a huge genetic component in this endeavor. I mean, I strongly believe that somebody with top tier genetics could be doing 90% wrong and still look better than most people.
Oh, absolutely.
And unfortunately, you know, a lot of people don't realize that. And so it can be frustrating when somebody says, well, this person is doing this, and you just want to like just rip their head off because they just don't get it. So I can understand, especially over years and years. And it's funny because I know you and Lane Norton don't get along, but I think you both have similar comments regarding that, where it just gets so frustrating over time to deal with people dealing with the same nonsense over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, when you are trying, right or wrong, to contribute good information and you see mostly garbage, you know, and that's where the internet, for good or for bad, has done, you know, both good things. Certainly it's definitely, you know, increased, I think, the prevalence and the awareness of like the scientific basis of training, but there's also the reality that at the end of the day, most people's first website is bodybuilding.com. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be critical and I'm not trying to be elitist. I did it too. You know, you're an oddity in that, like, your first really exposure was to my horribly boring book. But I mean, realize when I was 15, 16 and getting into this, all we had were the muscle magazines. So of course I read those. I mean, for years I read them religiously every month. Muscle and Fitness, Muscular Development, Iron Man, Muscle Mag International when I wanted a good laugh. Like I read every book that was out there. And were there some gems in there? Sure. But was there an immense amount of absolute garbage to sell supplements? Oh yeah, I've got all kinds of books on my shelf, and what I found, especially at the time in training, books fell into one of two categories. They were either academic tomes of no practical application whatsoever, or they were written by the top bodybuilder of the day. And at the time, nobody really talked about, the true hidden secret of the industry, which is steroids that have been part of it since the 80s. And that colors, you can do pretty much anything you want with enough drugs in your system, right? So you'd either be reading this tedious technical book, or you'd be reading, Franco Columbu's book on how to get big, which again, not necessarily terrible information, but you had, like you said, there's the genetic element. Lately, there is certainly an increase in, because what happened at the time, you were either a researcher or you're an athlete. And if you were a researcher who was an athlete, you're a runner, like you're an endurance athlete. You go back and look, there was so little strength training research. We are finally, even the folks I may be having issues with right now, I will give them credit for being researchers who are also lifters, because it gives them, I think, a very different perspective of how to set up workout designs. Like I would look at some of these early studies and go, who drew this workout up? Who thought this was even remotely something that looks like anything anybody is doing in the real world? Like, I mean, I would even ask that same question about that Han and All study, Mike Israetel. Like, okay, so they went from 10 to 32 sets a week over 6 weeks, but they were doing sets of 10 at 60% of 1 rep max with a 10-minute rest because they were circling the exercises. I'm just going, who trains like this? Nobody trains like this. Like, I'm sure they had a good reason for doing it that way, probably time efficiency, but in the aggregate, you have guys like Eric Helms, like Mike Zourdos, who are, Zourdos is a high-level powerlifter himself, coaches people. Eric, powerlifter, bodybuilder, coaches people. You can see in their study designs that they have the application background to do far more applied research, basically, in terms of like, okay, this is actually relevant to what people kind of do in the real world, right? Like Zourdos did he was testing, I think, one of his own approaches, which was for 3 weeks doing a squat, working up to a squat max single, and then dropping back to some doubles. And this is how I think he peaks, and he might peak some of the people he coaches. And he showed that, yeah, despite it being kind of up and down, this did lead them to a new peak for competition. But again, he's like, okay, this is actually a real world approach. Let's test this rather than doing some of the truly, truly goofy stuff I've seen done. Studied that you just look at this and go, why would it even occur to you to try this?
Right.
So I will say, and I don't know how I got off on this topic, but like in a research vein, certainly we are getting into that. Oh no, this came out of like the Lane Norton thing, the people, but there is so much garbage being contributed, because you can go to Instagram, and if you're a dude and you got big arms, or if you're a girl and, let's face it, have a nice butt, you can get a super big following and you can contribute whatever garbage you want. It is the only industry. Well, I'm not familiar with guitar culture, or I don't know if it's the same there, but I doubt it, because in this industry, like you said, it could be genetics. So many things work, right? No matter what kind of goofy crap you throw at it, whether it's drugs or genetics. And I don't want people to go, oh, anybody big is on. That's obviously nonsense. But so many different things can be argued to work that and I don't think you see that. Like in guitar, I don't imagine there's 1,000 different approaches people can bring to playing the guitar that are all effective.
Right.
But in training and in diet, any goofy ass idea that somebody thinks up, they can probably sell, and it might work. It might not. It might work for a reason completely opposite of what they are saying it works for, right? A lot of diets work that way. Oh, carbs, insulin, this, that. No, when we make you not eat them, you eat less. Like they work. They work, but not for the proposed reason, that's a whole separate thing. Right. And I mean, God, I met this was at the Arnold over a decade ago, and I'm flying back, and one of the booth girls is flying back to Austin, and like, I'm a nerd. I want to talk shop because I'm a nerd. And I'm like, what do you do for work? And she's great shape, perfect body. And I'm like, what do you just like, do cardio a couple times a week, maybe lift every once in a while. I'm like, okay. Just whatever, like, okay. But like, that's kind of it. You can get by on physique and people will believe you, and you can
Sure.
get by on very convincing logical arguments that often sound very good. And as long as you're careful to curate your page so that nobody ever sees the criticism or the evidence against you, it's real easy to maintain that. We've got the camel diet and the snake diet and lots of the folks in this industry selling garbage, and anyone that actually tries to present evidence that they're wrong just goes away. So we create a lot of echo chambers, and I'm sure I'm guilty of that to some degree. Don't get me wrong. We are all fallible human beings. We all want to be right. But at the end of the day, evidence is evidence, and there's a lot of garbage in this industry, and there has been, and there will continue to be. So,
yeah, it is unfortunate, and it's funny because in my world, like you said, it was probably unusual for me at such a young age to get into the science aspect of it. But that's how I started, and I'm thankful I did. But I was talking to somebody else who apparently is very heavily into fitness and Instagram and all these things, and I was talking to them, and I said, oh, well, like, I was mentioning some of the people I've had on the podcast, and I said, I had Lane Norton, Lyle McDonald will be coming on, etc. And they didn't know who you guys were. And I was what do you mean? How could you not know? Because, like, to me, it's like that is who the industry is, So it's just, there's huge branches, and some people it's just, all Instagram, butts and arms, like you said. It's just completely different worlds. And I feel like sometimes, like, echo chamber is a great way to say it, because these people, they just kind of get stuck in there, and they never are really exposed to, like, the other things.
You also see, we see what we're exposed to. I got into a big discussion with someone. This was years ago, like, I want to say it was International Society of Sports Nutrition. I think ISSN was in town for a conference, and a bunch of the nerds sat down to talk shop. And somebody was trying to argue me, because, I really think the evidence-based thing is improving. I said, you're wrong. He goes, no, I'm seeing lots and lots more people. I'm like, right, because by definition, those are the ones coming to your website and your page. However, in the aggregate, you could take every single one of us in this industry and combine all of the views that we get and all of the visitors we get and all of the people who think we know what we're talking about. And you can go to bodybuilding.com and find 1,000 times as many. And to T Nation and to Instagram. And the people you're seeing are the ones, because let's face it, the people that come to my Facebook group or read my books, it's one of two things. Either they are coming from that, like you, a scientific background. Frequently, they've already gone through the garbage and realized that it doesn't work and start looking for something else, or they get referred there. But the people who are not into what I'm selling or you're selling or Lane is selling or Eric is selling or Brad is, they're not going to go there. They're just not. So we see the people who by definition are interested in what we have to sell, and we don't see the people who by definition aren't. So it's easy to get a very skewed perspective. And he and I went back and forth for 30 minutes about this, and I go, it's just objectively, numerically, factually, you're wrong. Because if there's, like, my forum is dead. I think most forums are dead these days. Facebook has destroyed everything. But you know which two forums are still super active? Bodybuilding.com and T Nation. Because that is where people are going, for right or for wrong. I mean, T Nation's got a nice mix of good stuff and a lot of garbage, and I've watched them develop since they started, which was its own funny story. But yeah, so that's where the majority is. Beginners, right? Let's face it, it's typically insecure dudes. I mean, we're getting far more women that are coming into the weight game, and I don't know where they're, that's a different sort of thing, and I suspect it's probably more Instagram, and we're probably seeing as many being influenced by, the big booty Instagram girls as by some of the amazing powerlifters and athletes on there. One of the things I have certainly seen, probably the biggest change in my career, getting way off topic, is not only the presence of women in the weight room, which has just gone up exponentially, the number of women training far more intensely, and the number of women, training the big lifts and training them well. right? I'm seeing, because that was honestly, that was one of my biggest frustrations when I was younger. In most industries, I think you find that the majority do it fairly right, and there's a percentage that do it wrong. And in the gym, it's the exact opposite. It's always killed me that watching people lift in the gym, 90% of people's technique is appalling, because I think most people should be doing it right, and the minority should. But now it's just but I'm seeing a shift. I'm seeing more good squats. I'm seeing more good deadlifts. I think some of that's coming out of Instagram and the web. Honestly, some of it's coming out of CrossFit, for good or for bad, whole separate discussion. But I am seeing, like, I think a lot of the women's part of this. I mean, you see every goofy glute exercise. Yeah, I see it every day in the gym. You see the Stairmaster step and hip extension. You see that weird one-legged leg press on the assisted chin thing, and the semi-standing outer thigh. And I just look at stuff and go, huh, why? What, where, what, when? And it is, and it's some girl with a great butt who put it on Instagram as the booty circuit. And, the hour long or Brett Contreras. But don't get, Mr. Butt Fetish. Sorry. I'm in a mood. And it's, again, same thing. He's contributed a good, the hip thrust. We've seen, I'm never going to dismiss popping booty, and hip thrust has probably done more for glute development than almost any other thing, because women could do it without their shoulder girdle being limited, and they worked hard at it because they believed in it. But at the same time, we've got a lot of top tier powerlifters, strong women, female powerlifters, strong women competitors who are putting up some amazing numbers. Mm-hmm. But women can look at that. And I don't want to get in and look at that and go, okay, I can lift heavy. Not only is it okay, not only is it becoming socially normalized, but without getting into a very loaded set of terminology, I can do it while maintaining my femininity. And right. I like, that's a whole, like I said, gender politics I don't want to get into. I'm not using that in any term except we know what that's meant to mean. Right. And at the same time, there are women that are like, screw it, I just want to be strong. Like, but that fear of I'll get big if I go heavy, or all that nonsense, it'll turn me into a man, or whatever things that we believed that women were told for 30 years, that is going away. And the explosion of women in powerlifting, Olympic lifting, strong women in all levels of sports is just phenomenal. Like, powerlifting is like 45% women now. Federation here in town holds a women's only meet every year because there's finally enough female competitors to do it. I'm seeing a lot more masters female lifters come out. And I think and that's fascinating to me, because they're of a generation that when they were in their 20s and their 30s, this was not acceptable. Women did not go into the weight room. Women did not lift heavy. Right. And I think they're finally realizing that I can do this and it'll be awesome. And they love it. And so that's, some of the good, and there's also a lot of bad, and you just sort of take it where it falls. But there is a lot of appeal to, well, I'm big, I'm cut, I'm in good shape, ergo, I know what I'm doing.
Right. And, you talked before about the insecurities there with a lot of people who get into this. I think, bodybuilding and this endeavor in general people gravitate towards it. And one other trait we see is obsessiveness. Another is, and I would definitely fall into that category. And then also people who are just kind of delusional. And I think bodybuilders, bodybuilders on the whole, really, I've seen a lot of really delusional bodybuilders. And something I'll see people say all the time is they'll compete year after year after year. And this doesn't apply to everybody. Some people, of course, do make great improvements. But a lot of people look exactly the same. Oh, yeah. And they come in the exact same weight, but they somehow convince themselves that this is the best they've ever looked. And to be honest, it's almost like, maybe that's good because it keeps them motivated. At this point, for me, doing this 15 years, I'm kind of a little, it's harder to be motivated when nothing's happening at this point. Sure. I'm just fighting the next 15 years to hold on to muscle. So, but why do you think it is that so many bodybuilders are delusional? You just see it all the time.
That's one of those things that's always really confused me. You go to, a local natural bodybuilding competition. And I got talked into judging one time, and man, that was the really? long. How friends are like, hey man, what are you doing on Sunday? And that usually means they're going to ask you to help them move. My training partner's like, hey man, what are you doing on Saturday morning? I'm like, nothing. Why? He goes, you want to judge a bodybuilding contest? Okay. One of the judges had fallen out, and my friend was, or my training partner was friends with one of the top natural bodybuilders here in town, a guy named Dave Gooden, who Texas Shredder. He's been around forever. He's I'll call him a friend. I've known him and interacted with him, and I trained at his old gym, Hyde Park. And but anyway, so like you go to natural shows, right, and there'll be 3 guys that just look phenomenal, like just in fantastic shape. And then there's kind of a middle group that is okay. And then there's people that show up who looks like they forgot to train and or diet. Mm-hmm. Like, and it really is, it's always been perplexing to me. Like, I don't think you see that in other sports. Like, right? You're not a top cyclist. You're not going to run a 2-hour marathon. Like, bodybuilding, for right or for wrong, it is appearance-based, right? Assumptively, at some point, they looked at the magazine and they looked at themselves and went, huh, I don't look like that. I mean, that would be my assumption. Or they get backstage, right? And everybody's posing down and oiled. You got guys with like 6-pack abs and cuts everywhere, and they're just going to go, huh. And I don't know. I think part of it, usually it's, these guys that they're probably the best in their gym, I suppose. And bodybuilders, and I think this goes back to the insecurity, bodybuilders, I think more so than a lot of other athletes, don't take criticism well. And, every bodybuilder that loses, it's all politics. Well, right. No, you weren't in shape. Like, yes, don't get me wrong, there are politics. However, that's just a cop-out. My training partner, who's a phenomenal bodybuilder, he lifted for years, he was strong, he was jacked, he competed at the highest levels of natural NPC. Everybody at the gym told him how awesome he was all the time. And it was my job, as far as I'm concerned, was to reality check him every single day and tell him what sucked. And that's what I did because it made him better, right? Everybody would just blow smoke up his butt, and I'd be like, dude, your hamstrings suck. We need to do a specialization for it. And so I think a lot of guys tend to surround themselves with that. I think you might also get into, there's the human brain is fallible. And, you think about eating disorders, right? And that is predominant, or bigorexia, whatever, they're calling it now. And like what you see in the mirror is not what's reality. And I think there might be some of that going on. But it is really a good question because, and I get it. You get to a certain point and like you want to think you're better. I do think one of the problems bodybuilding has compared to, say, powerlifting or Olympic lifting or strongman, strongwoman, there is no truly objective criterion, right? In powerlifting, if your weights are not going up at meet, you are not getting, like, objectively, you are not getting stronger. This is not debatable. In strongman, strongwoman, a little bit less so because the events aren't quite as, but if your objective performance is not, same thing with Olympic lifting, your numbers are either going up, they're staying the same, or they're going down. That's very objective. Bodybuilding has that subjective nature, right? Like, yes, if your poundages are going up to a first approximation, that will correlate somewhat with muscle growth. It's not one-to-one. It is part of the equation, nutrition, sleep, genetics, yada, yada, yada. But there, yes, you can do tape measures, you can do calipers, and that certainly can help give you some sort of idea. But most of us most folks will just get in the mirror. And I used to joke, and it's not a joke, every gym has the magic mirror, right? The one that makes you look 10 pounds leaner and 10 pounds bigger and brings, whether it's, I don't know if it's the lighting or the mirror structure or whatever it is, everybody loves that mirror. That's the one that they will always go to because it makes them look better than they are. And it's, people are not getting, I think, just objective, but it's such a subjective thing that it's like, especially when you're at a high level, right? If you're grinding away to gain that pound or two a year, right? And you're at that point, right? After 15 years, you could dedicate your entire life for the next year to it, and you might gain a pound or two.
Maybe,
and you reach the point where it's just like, I don't have the energy anymore, right? I just don't. You're just avoiding the slow slide to mediocrity, and wait till you get to 49. Just trust me. Just wait till everything hurts. And so I think, you want to believe that you're getting bigger or coming in better conditioned. And I mean, conditioning, I think the diet aspect is probably easier to diet, as you get more dialed in. So you can always come in leaner, but once you've been training for 3 or 4 years, you're not getting much bigger no matter what you do.
Yeah, right.
And that's something that's, I think, especially in the US, where just work harder, right? That's always been another real problem with bodybuilding in this country is the reality of drugs. And this is sort of a side topic, but it's something I've run into a lot, right? You've got guys like, how much do you weigh? Like, I can tell you're big.
I'm like 200 pounds.
Okay, which is on the big side. How tall are you?
About 6'1".
Okay,
so not too big, but
yeah, but for 6'1", that's like what so there would be guys on my forum you might remember from Monkey Island, Hunky, New York City, Hunky, right? This dude was amazing, right? He was 5'6", 5'7". He was in, I want to say, the low 190s, fairly lean, right? And I told him, I go, dude, you could go crush any natural competition you want. He had great symmetry, great muscle bellies. I'm like, dude, but we have, okay, so Arnold competed, depending on who you believe, somewhere between 220 and 240. Even if he was 240, people weren't as conditioned then. He probably would have come in, 230 in today's shape, maybe even a little bit lower, fully dehydrated. Lou Ferrigno was 280 back in the day, but he was also like 6'6", like he was a giant. You have guys now who are contest lean above 300 pounds. Right? Like, I don't follow bodybuilding, but I don't know, guys like Big Ramy. I mean, these guys, I came home from the Arnold once, and Ronnie Coleman was sitting in first class. He looks like a different species, right? Seeing him seeing him on stage is one thing. Seeing him in person, literally taking up 2 first class seats, my head could only go that's the Belgian double muscled bull, right? This guy is like 280 in contest shape, or probably heavier now, or was. I know he's got a lot of injuries and stuff. But when you're 180, right, a lean 180 or a lean 190, right, you are bigger than the grand majority of dudes out there, right? Even in natural shows, what's the big class? 165s. That's the reality. Is not a lot of tiny weights, because it's hard to be 150 unless you're 5 foot tall. You'll see some heavyweights in shape more now in the 220 range. The biggest classes are like the 165s and whatever the 170s are. And you're bigger than most people, and you're in better shape than most people. But if you look at a dude that's 300, you think you're small. And that's it. And since people aren't being honest about their drug use, about what it takes to get to that level, we have whatever. We live in the U.S. It is a Puritan work ethic. There's no genetic limit. You just work harder. Just work as hard as you can. There is no genetic limit to be hit. And I go, okay. I've gotten to that argument with so many people. And it's okay. And, years ago I got with a guy, and he was like, there's no genetic limit. So I'm like, cool. What are you squatting? It was 500. I go, great. You've been training for 10 years. When are you going to put up 1,000? Right. When are you going to, right? If there's no genetic limit, why are you only gaining 10? When are you going to hit that 1,000 that guys are hitting now at your body weight? 10 more years, 20 more years, you're past your prime anyway. Right. So, and that's the reality. And I think a lot of guys don't want to accept that they're not getting any bigger.
Yeah. And I can tell you, as somebody with, maybe average genetics on my end, and it was a tough realization, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, because I was an athlete for, a good portion of my life. And I always felt like I had pretty good athletic genetics. But when it came to hypertrophy, I was much stronger than I looked. You know? But when it came to actually putting on size, and it just I was okay, but it was never I never blew up. And as somebody who has also spent a lot of time reading into things and knowing what the right way to go about it is, when you have other people who say, oh, it is work ethic, and then they say, okay, you're about average in size, you must have average work ethic. Sure. That can be very frustrating, because no, you have no idea what I put into it. And, it just kind of is a cycle there.
Oh, sure. And I mean, and what's even interesting there, right? Because when you get there's no such thing as genetics, and okay, if you say so, they are finally starting to identify who are the high and low responders, right? And I think this is just getting back into science nerdery for a little bit. A problem with all research studies is they're generally reporting the averages. And all it takes, right? And there's weird studies that are there was zero change because 10 improve, if 10 improve and 10 decrease, right? There's zero average change, but that hides the actual results. Actually, this additional analysis of the HAN study, the high volume study, went ahead and it actually showed the individual responses for the quadricep. The muscle biopsy took the little chunk of muscle. And of the 31 subjects, only 15 grew. The other 15 shrank.
Oh, wow.
And to varying rates. Like some of them, it was like this, and the other ones, there was one guy that got a super high. And what was interesting is the guy that shrank the most in terms of the units, whatever the measurement was, he shrank more than the guy that grew the most grew. So like the guy that grew the most grew 1,500, whatever the units were. The guy that lost the most lost 2,000 of whatever the units were.
Wow.
But it's like you look at that, and like to me, that individual response is a far more interesting question.
Yeah.
And so when they actually looked at it, they've now done a third paper. They're really getting a lot of traction out of this one, which is good, very, very typical. And now they've looked at, okay, what were the predictors of the high and low responders? And they didn't find super strong. They found, okay, if you've got more fast twitch muscle fibers, you tend to grow a little much. That's not really news.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing they found that is not surprising, but is interesting, the people that started out with the biggest muscle fibers grew the least, and vice versa, which of course just means, well, when you're smaller, you have more potential for growth. Like,
Sure.
again,
Yeah.
not really a lot, not shocking, but, and they cited a lot of the other research on this. And like, there was a very recent paper that it was looked at, there's the whole hormone hypothesis, which is a bunch of, it has very little impact, the acute testosterone and GH
Sure.
spikes. But what they showed was that the high responders' bodies upregulated the testosterone receptor to a much greater degree. So so that was where the response was to training, was that the hormone changes didn't have anything to do with it, but the cells basically became more sensitive to the testosterone that was available. And other papers, I'd have to go back and look at them, have found basically similar things. Some people just genetically are luckier than others, and that's not debatable. And, I think what happens, people hear that, right? They go, oh, you're just using genetics as an excuse. No one's saying people with poor genetics can't grow, period, right? That's not what's being said. What's being said is, well, just fat loss is the same way. Some people have it objectively easier than others. I think the difference is with fat loss, go stick somewhere where they can eat no food, they will come off. Right. With muscle gain, clearly, no matter what you do, volume intensity, short of plugging in 600 milligrams, there's just a point you're not, if you don't have the right genetics. And people have even thrown that out regarding pro bodybuilders using drugs. There seems to be a genetic component. I listened to a really good podcast. I want to say it was Scott Stevenson that talked about that. And super smart guy.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite people.
And he talked about like biological differences in certain enzyme activities and things like that were part of why some people can take drugs and just blow up. And more importantly, not keel over, right? And not get all the super negatives. And I think he even mentioned one, I want to say in Asian cultures, the nature of one of their liver enzymes, and this is a drug testing thing, they can take a higher dose of testosterone and not get the testosterone to epitestosterone ratio, which is one of the older drug tests. For whatever reason, their ratio doesn't change as much. So it's easier, and he looked at what little is known about that in terms of probably what's going on with the muscle cell and androgen receptor density and this and that and the other. And you can see it. There's a website somewhere online, and it shows pro bodybuilders who went off, and they lose like 60 pounds in a matter of months. It's just ridiculous. They go from being pro bodybuilders to looking like they don't train.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
And then if they go back on, they just explode. It's really mind blowing to watch. So that is, and of course at the natural level, it is. That's what I've always disagreed with. A lot of people going, oh, it's just hard work, and the guys who win do it this way. And I go, but the thing is that the other 98% of people who never got big did the same thing. Right. So it's clearly, there's a lot of dumb shit in training, a lot of bad things people do. But for every person that succeeded doing this, 10 times more didn't get anywhere with it, or didn't get nearly as far, or the whole clean eating contest diet thing. The winners did this. Maybe, but let's talk about the 98% who washed out on the diet, who never got into shape, who cracked, who ended up with an eating disorder. The majority are even the Bulgarian Olympic lifters. People love to trot that out. they broke 65 out of 66 lifters to generate one gold medalist. From a individual standpoint, is the one important, or is the 65 that are chronically, permanently injured what's important? So
and I think I think the individual difference, it's so huge, and you know, you obviously are very aware of it, and I think it's becoming more talked about now. But you know, so Scott Stevenson and I, we go back probably 4 years now, and like he's a very, very smart guy. We were talking about that, how there's actually, because when you look at testosterone levels themselves aren't, you know, there's not a huge correlation with muscle mass, but androgen receptor density, I think they found there is quite a correlation there. I think he was saying that or something else. It came from the mother, because I remember we were joking about like whatever, Ronnie Coleman's mother must have been like a freak, but he was saying how that it's influenced from the mother there. But yeah, that the receptor density. So I didn't know that was in the recent paper though, that they were talking about that.
Well, it was mainly their discussion. Let me see if I can actually find it real quick, just because it was really interesting. Like I'm lazier than people think, quite honestly, and basically, papers like this, I let them do the heavy lifting. Like I tend to find a lot of, you know, the stuff they talk about in the discussion, because usually people that are obsessed with this one thing, they keep track of the literature freaking a little bit better than I can. So I just let them do all the heavy lifting and go pull all the studies that they read. Let's see. Several studies have reported that in previously untrained participants, ribosome biogenesis, and ribosomes are what take, when you send the signal, they take the amino acids and read the, I want to say messenger RNA, it's been a while, to make the actual proteins. Ribosome biogenesis is greater in high versus low responders. Our findings are similar. Fiber types, I know they talk about, you know, but there are all these. So fiber type, they're probably going to find, if they haven't already, differences in like how satellite cells, whether those increase in number or not. Two studies reported that changes in skeletal muscle androgen receptor protein content correlate with increased skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So yeah, so they're starting to really look, I think, at some of these individual differences, and what may come out of this. Right, because for, again, bro science. Here we go. We recently proposed high responders may possess a greater mitochondrial volume, given that muscle growth requires high amounts of cellular energy. And we recently reported that high responders that were previously untrained possess greater muscle citrate, which that's an enzyme that's kind of indicative of mitochondria. Right, so all this makes a certain logical sense, right? We need to have sufficient cellular energy to build muscle. We need to have ribosomes to actually synthesize it. The androgen receptor helps send the signal. They may find that there's differences in how stuff activates, you know, the mTOR complex, which people have been talking about forever. Although I think pretty sure I wrote the first article talking about AMP kinase and mTOR. That was about 15 years ago.
Oh, really?
And I was keeping up with a lot of nerdy molecular stuff much more then. But what I think two things will come out of this is that, one, obviously we'll realize that people just differ in the propensity to grow. But what might come out of this is a way to personalize training to a greater or lesser degree, right? And you've seen some of this, and like coaches talked about all this all the time, right? You can get into somatotype, which is certainly rough at best. But it's like, oh, you know, the skinny guy, the ectomorph, should train in a certain way and a certain diet, and the mesomorph, the classic muscular guy, and there's probably elements of truth to that. I think if you look at the physiology of what's going on with insulin resistance and things of that nature, and you know, we might find that, okay, assuming we could determine it, well, maybe some people need to, like, if for whatever reason their mitochondrial density or activity is what's limiting them, maybe aerobic work will actually help them grow, or maybe doing metabolic weight training, or maybe trying to spend some time, you know, to upregulate ribosomes, which actually Dan Duchesne was talking about 30 years ago because he was a genius, or whatever it is. We may very well find that either people do respond to certain kinds of training to better or less degrees, or that they're training, if we can specify it a little bit more. One sort of interesting tidbit in this, some rugby studies, and first they took the rugby athletes and they gave them like one of 4 workouts. It was like heavy strength training, heavy power training, bodybuilding training, and then like med ball power, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And first they measured which gave the optimal salivary testosterone response. Right now, this is we've already talked about that. Bump in testosterone means less than nothing, but it might be indicative of something, right? It might be correlative of an overall beneficial response. So they identified like their 2 best responses and 2 worst. And then they did the follow-up study and said, what happens if we put people and train them according to their best or worst salivary response? And they found that training with their best salivary response gave them the best training response, and vice versa. So if you basically not training them according to, take your pick, physiology, genetics, psychology, philosophy, epistemology, like take your pick on what that's tying into. But I think there is something certainly to be said for that. I have no doubt. I mean, I'm a general believer progressive tension overload is key. Volume is secondary. Some people seem to do better with a little more volume and a little less intensity. Some people seem to do better with a little higher intensity, a little bit less volume. We will probably find that is tying into this when it's going to take a lot more research to take first identifying what the limiter is, figure out some way to determine this for a given individual, and then adjust their training to maybe attempt to attack that weak point. Even that, so that second Honadol data analysis, the one that found the sarcoplasmic stuff. Now, they don't know why exactly this happened, right? Over 6 weeks, it was almost exclusively sarcoplasmic proteins involved in energy production. And one of these, I'm trying to finish a website article on it, and I can't get it done. But they propose 3 different reasons for why this might be occurring. One, it might just be specific to the training, right? Mike and the rest can argue with me all they want. No, this workout was intense. No, it wasn't. Sets of 10 at 60% are warm-up sets. They were all at 4 reps in reserve. With a 10-minute rest, you could do that all day till you got bored. I'm sorry, there was no cumulative fatigue across any of the workouts. It stayed at 4. They were 4 reps from failure, no matter how many sets they did in the workout. There was no tension overload. There was no fatigue overload. But it was a high volume. Well, high volume training, I'm sorry, that's an endurance stimulus. Nobody wants to hear that. But studies actually in the ketogenic diet book back in the 80s and bodybuilders of the day trained how? High reps with pump, short rest periods. Their muscles were more like endurance athletes than strength power athletes. And there's other work to that degree. Bodybuilders' muscles are not generating the force you would expect of strength power athletes like powerlifters and Olympic lifters.
Right.
Which means they're developing more. So it could be that it's specific to the training, that just generates the much maligned sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. But it could also be that we have stages of remodeling. Maybe in the early stages, we need to develop the energetic pathways, right? We need to upregulate the cell's ability to generate ATP to make energy to support muscle growth in a secondary stage. Now, I don't know that I buy it because these were trained individuals. But again, so then you look at their second study, people with the most fiber size saw the least growth and vice versa. Maybe we have a point where, like we have the muscle fiber, right? This is video, right? Not just audio?
Yeah.
Just making sure. The last podcast I did wasn't. Right, so we've got the cell that's a certain size. And we've got myofibrils, the contractile things surrounded by all the other stuff. Maybe once these get to a certain thickness, a certain diameter, the cell says no more. Maybe then we have to increase the sarcoplasm to give more room for growth, for lack of a better way of putting it. Whereas if it's smaller, there's more, like it could be something along those lines. And this is something I've been kind of kicking around in my head for like 10 some odd years. It's like maybe the sequencing, maybe we do some high rep, high volume stuff early on, build those energetic pathways, build some capillaries. And this isn't even new. Perillo was talking about this 20 years ago. Vince Duranda was talking about it even longer ago than that. We increase the cell's ability to not only generate ATP and fuel to bring in nutrients, find some way to increase ribosome number, and training in itself tends to do that. Mm-hmm. So maybe we do high volume to build up those components. We follow that up with the actual tension training to stimulate the actual myofibril growth. Well, we're right back to volume into intensity, right? This is, again, I've invented nothing new. That's most of my career. I refine old concepts.